This is part 4 of our series on Islam, where we look at the theology behind the religion. Now, you got to realize that everything we're going to talk about today is based off 3 sources. There was the direct writings of Muhammad, known as the Quranic writings, or the Quran. There was the writings about Muhammad by those who knew him, which is the Hadith. And then over the centuries, those 2 things were interpreted over time by scholars, and that tradition is known as the Sunnah. So those 3 put together are the basis for Muslim theology, both then and now. Some basics. Beliefs by Islam is that God is one, so they're a monotheistic religion. They view man as made from clay, but spirits or jinns as made by fire or spiritual source. And interestingly, in Islam, these spirits can be both good or bad, and they actually happen to be a little bit more prone to evil than men. So that makes them different from Christian theology, in which you're either a good or a bad angel. They also believe in Satan, and they believe he disobeyed Allah's command to serve Adam. So remember that Islam draws on the 5 books of Moses and our 4 Gospels, and they call those previous scriptures. They delineate themselves back to Ishmael and Abraham, so they share very much in Judaic theology. Much like certain branches of Catholicism, Islam is a works-based theology, so it's very difficult for any Muslim at any point to be assured of salvation, which again differentiates it from Christianity. 1 John opens his letter letting us know how we can know that we're saved. In Islam, there is no such assurance, unless you die in the act of jihad, which assures you not only direct access to heaven, but a little harem to enjoy, made up of 72 virgins. Hence the propensity for jihad within Islam. Now, the very first caliph, the guy who took over from Muhammad when he died, was Abu Bakr, who started the Sunni branch of Islam. There is a specific difference between the 2 branches, and we'll look at that right now. Ali was Muhammad's cousin. He was the 4th caliph who took over after the other 3 died in the Rashidun Caliphate. He started the Shia or Shiite branch. There's also nowadays a Sufi branch of Islam, which is a derivative of the Shiites. Within Sunni Islam, there's what's called the 5 pillars. Now, firstly is simply the declaration of faith in the tenets of Islam in general. Then you have the obligatory prayer, which is the 5 times a day prayer where they all face Mecca, regardless of where they are in the world. You have compulsory giving of money, and there's no specific percentage given in the Hadith or the Quran, but it's considered based on your personal wealth and abilities. Obviously, the Ramadan fast is another must-do for Muslim devotees, as well as a once-in-your-lifetime, if your wealth and health enable it, to Mecca, the Kaaba mosque in Mecca, the single holiest site in all of Islam. The Shia or Shiites have what's called the Twelvers. Now, they have 5 basic rules and then 10 other rules. That makes 15. I don't know where they get the term Twelvers from, but that's what the research shows. They ask you to believe in the monotheism of Islam, the divine justice, the prophethood of Muhammad, the links of all Shiites back to Muhammad, because remember, Ali, the founder of the Shiites, was a direct family member of Muhammad, and in the Day of Judgment. There are 10 other basic rules, including the giving of money and the pilgrimage to Mecca. So all Muslims do the one time in their life pilgrimage, whether they're men or women, to the Kaaba mosque in Mecca. Christians worship on Sundays, Jews on Saturdays, and Fridays is the day for mosque worship for Muslims. Again, they would trace themselves back to Ishmael, who was the firstborn of Abraham, so they say they are the true peoples of God, and hence their ongoing dispute with the Jews and the Christians. Sharia law is a very hot topic. Surveys have been shown that well over 50% of Muslims worldwide desire Sharia law to be the law of the land wherever they live, whether it's in the United States, in Western Europe, or Muslim countries. So the question is, what exactly is Sharia law? Sharia law is essentially a prescription of laws that dictate what is the punishment for certain acts within the Islamic world. If you murder somebody, traditionally you are to die in a similar manner as in which you killed someone, and often it's the family members of the victim who get to carry out the execution. That's not always the case, but that has been traditionally the case. For adultery, you get stoned to death. Homosexuals are killed within the Islamic world. It happens today. You can see it on YouTube. They're getting thrown off of buildings. fairly graphic. If you decide to leave Islam, there is a protocol in which they try to woo you back. If you refuse that wooing, well, you're a goner. And the more palatable regions of Sharia law have to do with where there's only amputation for stealing. If you fornicate, in other words, you're not married, neither is the other person, and you guys get together, it's 100 lashes in public. If you consume alcohol, you get the 80 lashes. And you look at countries nowadays like Saudi Arabia, they actually have a religious police that carry these things out. Another thing that helps us to understand the protocols within Islam is that once they have conquered a land, here's the extent of the Abbasid Caliphate, when it went all the way up into Portugal and Spain. Once Islam has conquered a land, they have the divine rights to it forever afterwards. So they're essentially always plotting their retaking of Spain, Portugal. They used to have Greece as well, and Indian Peninsula. So within the theology of Islam is the sense that they must take over the world, and they have a special rights to places they used to previously occupy. Now, the concept of jihad is an interesting one. There's three basic aspects. There is the Muslim zones. Those are areas that are under Islamic rule, so there's no jihad occurring at that place and time. There are also peace zones where they have never conquered in the past. They may conquer in the future, but currently they have truce with those countries, and there is no active jihad aimed in that direction. And of course, there are these zones of war where jihad is explicitly trying to expand the Muslim caliphate, which, according to the Hadith and the Quran and the Sunnah, eventually has to cover the entire planet. So essentially, really, the planet Earth is a zone of war, or will be eventually. A little-known caveat in the jihad context is that taqiyya allows Muslims to lie to infidels if it advances Islam. So theologically, they have no guilt if they're lying to you if you're a non-Muslim. Whether it's a business deal or a political diplomatic deal, they have the basis within their structure of theology to lie guilt-free and sin-free. This would be good to know if, as a politician, you are negotiating with a Muslim country such as, let's say, I don't know, Iran? Now, within the Islamic world, there are a series of holy sites. The number one most holy site is the mosque in Mecca, also known as the Kaaba. This is where the Mecca is done once in a lifetime. Every year on the 8th or days, month of the last month in Islam's calendar is when you can perform Mecca. So in those days, you've got 3+ million Muslims making the trip and walking around the Kaaba. It is one of the largest gatherings, single gatherings on earth. The second most holy site is the mosque in Medina, which is where Muhammad used to live with his wife and is now buried. And the third and final most holy site within Islam is the mosque in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, known as the Dome of the Rock Mosque. Shia and Sufi Muslims have their own miscellaneous mosques that are also considered holy sites, but in general, those three mosques are the center point of Islam in general. Now, the concept of women in Islam is an interesting one. Throughout various regions and times in Islamic history and geography, women have had higher and lower positions. They've been sultanas, they've been queens, they've been heads of state in some ways, they've been high up in academia, so it's a bit of a hodgepodge. However, there are some Quranic references that do establish a superiority of men over women within the Islamic faith. Quran chapter 4 verse 11 states that men will have twice the inheritance of females. The Quranic verse chapter 2 verse 282 says that for one man's testimony you need two women's testimony to equivocate it. Quranic chapter 5 verse 6 says that after shaking hands with a woman, a Muslim man is to wash his hands. Chapter 2 verse 223 says that man has the same ownership and rights over his wife than he does his land. This is an explicitly sexual passage and essentially gives a much more sexual authority of man over the woman than vice versa. Now, interestingly, chapter 4 verse 24 and chapter 33 verse 50 in the Quran, it claims that Muslim men are allowed the right to gather sex slaves outside of marriage. This is interesting, and we'll look at this in our next installment where we look at modern Islam. but you have seen a history, past and present, of a manifestation of Muslim men feeling they have the right to sexual access to infidel women because it's explicitly listed as a right within the Quran. So that wraps up our very quick snapshot of Muslim theology, holy sites, rituals, and lifestyles. It gives you the very broad strokes, but it gives you a beginner understanding of the mindset, the beliefs, and the platform from which all Muslim behavior has been occurring for the last 1,000+ years. Thank you for joining us.